Sorry we're starting a little bit late. Just a reminder to people, because the building closes at 8, we're going to wrap up at around 7:30, so people have enough time to get somewhere to pray Maghrib. We're trying to get them to keep the building open a little bit later so that we can all pray Maghrib together. But you just anticipate us wrapping up at 7:30, and then people can stick around the building if they want to till 8, but they're going to make you leave at 8 either way, so you won't be able to pray Maghrib here. So just to jump into it, the last however many weeks, we've been looking at the second phase of the Prophet's propagation of Islam, the public da'wah, and within that, the responses that have been coming and the persecution that has been taking place. And in the frame of that persecution, we've talked about a lot of difficulties and a lot of challenges that have been coming up. A couple of things that we want to highlight before we get into a little bit of discussion and then move on to another topic. We talked, I think, last week about Abu Jahl, who was one of the greater opponents of Islam. And he came from the Banu Makhzum tribe, which was a rival tribe to the Banu Hashim, the tribe of the Prophet ﷺ. And so there is one instance where the Prophet is now praying in front of the Kaaba at this time where they're being persecuted. He was one of the few people who would actually pray publicly in front of the Kaaba. And the Kaaba is where everything was taking place. And so at this juncture, Abu Jahl, he makes a proclamation that he's going to go and harm the Prophet of God, literally step on his neck with his foot. And he gets to a place where as he gets closer to the Kaaba, he gets taken aback and is pushed back away, startled. And when the people ask the Prophet what took place, the Prophet says that Allah had protecting him, that there were trenches with angels kind of filling these trenches, guarding the Prophet, a deep description that's given. But relevant to our conversation of the Seerah, this is where the latter part of Surah Al-Alaq gets revealed around this incident. So if you remember months ago when we were talking about the first revelations, you had Iqra, the first revelation, Iqra, read, right? And that's the first verse of Surah Al-Alaq. And you get that up until the first 5 verses. So people want to just pull this up. Surah Al-Alaq is the 96th chapter of the Quran. And verses 1 to 5 were these first verses that we talked about in the first grouping of revelations that came down. And now, in the context of this interaction with Abu Jahl, we have the balance of the rest of this chapter that's revealed. Does anybody have it in front of them? Can read to us the translation of these verses, verse 6 onwards. Does anybody want to read? Yeah, go for it.
Nay, but verily man is alone, that he thinketh himself independent. Lo, unto thy Lord is the return. Hast thou seen him who dissuadeth a slave when he prayeth?
You keep going.
Hast thou seen if he relieth on the guidance of Allah, or enjoineth piety? Hast thou seen if he denieth Allah's guidance and is forward? Is he then unaware that Allah seeth? Nay, but if he cease not, he will seize him by the forelock, the lying, sinful forelock. Then let him call upon his henchmen.
There's a couple more verses.
We will call the guards of hell. Nay, obey not thou him, but prostrate thyself and draw near unto Allah.
So as you're reading like these verses, you want to be able to understand the context also of Revelation that's coming in to play, right? Literally here, Abu Jahl is in a place where he's seeking to deny the Prophet his capacity to pray. And these moments are being enshrined in the Quran in real time. giving an understanding also as to where Allah sees his support of the messenger of God. And Abu Jahl is in a place where experientially he's engaged in these acts of persecution, but simultaneously is dealing with the reality of Allah's protection of the Prophet in the mode in which this protection is coming from. And the opportunity to think about where and how these verses are being revealed to give an indication as to what the end result is going to be in the form of this persecution, right? That Abu Jahl is going to still have accountability. For many of us, especially right now, when the world feels so heavy and so difficult, we ask a lot of these questions sometimes, like who is watching? Who is seeing what's taking place? Where do you find equity and balance and justice? And here, Abu Jahl is transgressing against boundaries, preventing someone from just existing in a form of what is innate to their identity. All they want to do is worship Allah. That's all they're trying to do is worship Allah. They're trying to be, they're simply trying to exist. And the leveraging of his clout, his power, his privilege, his sense of self that we talked about last time, it gets to a place where all of these things that we've been discussing in relation to Abu Jahl, it comes up in these kinds of instances, and these verses are enshrining this, right? The contextualization of these verses, their revelation, come at this place when Abu Jahl is engaged in this form of persecution. And there's other verses that are similar to this, right? There's an instance where Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, he intervenes and he engages now a man from the Quraysh by the name of Utbah, who is that much more severe in his persecution. And he's literally trying to choke the Prophet of God to death. And Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, he says to him, Aturiduna an yaktuluna rajulan yakulu Rabbi Allah, that do you want to kill a man who all he says is Allah is my Lord? If you go to Surah Al-Ghafir, in its 28th verse, you can look it up later, this is verbatim like stated in the Quran in reference to a story about Musa alayhi salam and Fir'aun, as these verses are also being revealed in the context of what's happening here, right? Giving an indication again as to what the nature is that has been seen historically, that you have, like the Fir'auns of the world, you have those who are oppressors, those who are engaged in these acts of persecution and difficulties and trials and tests, and you have those who stand up against them. You have those who are proclaiming what it means to be a person of ethics and values and stand up in the prism of inequity. And may Allah make us always those who stand against oppression and never those who aid in the oppression of any peoples. When you're reading these verses, you want to be able to understand their connection to the prophetic biography, because as we've said before, the Seerah makes the Quran concrete. You know, it gives us an understanding of how the Prophet is living these verses and giving us an indication of where it is that he's guiding his companions. One of the things that we've said consistently as we've been describing now the socialization of the Prophet, we talked about him as a shepherd, we talked about him as an orphan, we talked about him as a child when he goes from Mecca to Medina, he goes from Mecca to the Banu Sa'ad and stays with Halima Sa'diyah, and all of these things, how they prep and ready the Prophet for his prophethood, and the notion that there's nothing without meaning in Allah's plan. In the context now of these 2 or 3 years, because next time we're going to get to something that happens in the 5th year of Revelation, which is a migration to Abyssinia, what we know as modern-day Ethiopia, that a group of the Quraysh in particular, of the early Muslims, 12 men and 4 women, they migrate to Abyssinia. And why we say they're Qurayshi is because what was unique about those first 16 who migrated in the first wave of migration to Abyssinia was that they were of the likes of Uthman ibn Affan, radiallahu anh, for example, people of wealth, people who are of the elite. They had the means and capacity to actually make this migration. You didn't see Abdullah bin Mas'ud, or you didn't see like the people who were coming from lower classes or slaves that were making this migration. It was the people that came from a noble background in its onset. But before we get to that place where they deem that it's too difficult to get their ability to worship Allah, they're going through a lot of persecution. They're going through a lot of difficulty, a lot of trial and tribulation. We've talked about it in a lot of detail. The level of atrocity that wasn't just hardship, but the grotesque nature in which Abu Jahl and others were doing this to men, women, children, people of all backgrounds. Why do we think this comes at this phase of revelation? This difficulty, this hardship, this trial, it's happening right at the onset of the public propagation of Islam. And you can see this paralleled in other religious communities as they begin to push against what is normative societally and call to a different mode, right? When Jesus, peace be upon him, preaches Christianity, he is not met with embraces. They literally attempt to crucify him. In our tradition, we believe that he is taken from the cross and ascends to the heavens, and he's going to return in the frame of a messianic figure towards the end of times. But they are persecuted deeply, right? They're not treated well. They're undergoing a lot of hardship. What is the point of this? Like, if we understand there's nothing without meaning in Allah's plan, and the consistency of hardship is something that we see echoing through the world right now, we see it going on with these people at this time, how do we understand why there is these kinds of difficulties and trials that are taking place? Does the question make sense? And we want to be able to understand it because for a lot of us, this is where we get stuck sometimes. Challenge comes, hardship comes, there's difficulty that comes, trial comes, tribulation comes, fitna comes, however you want to deem in a language sense, they're going through it right now. And they're going to go through it for a while because until the Prophet gets to Medina, these first years of revelation that transcend a decade of lived experience, that end with him having assassination attempts taking place against him. They're going through a lot of trial and a lot of persecution in the midst of all of this. What does our tradition have to say? Like, why the hardships? Why the difficulties? Why the tests? Why the tribulations? What is the point of it? If there's not anything without meaning in Allah's plan, like, what is the reasons as to why these are things that come at us? If you can turn to the persons next to you just so we can start kind of talking and discussing, why do we think this is? And we want to be able to attach meaning to this, even if we get to a place where we say, I don't know, because there's going to be challenge and it's subjective, right? You might get pushed down in relation to a loved one getting lost. You might lose a job. You might have family members that are living in countries right now that are in deep conflict. Sudan, the Congo. We see what's happening in Palestine. May Allah make things easy for all of them. People impacted by natural disaster, famine. There's all kinds of struggles that people have, right? You might have issues with family. You might have issues with relationships. You might have issues with yourself. There's trials that we go through and tests that we go through that they're not meant to be in a vacuum just for the sake of experiencing it. Here now, we've talked about for about a month just the level of persecution that these people are going through in various ways. Bilal ibn Rabah going through persecution. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud going through persecution. Ammar ibn Yasir, his father, his mother, Sumayya, all of them going through persecution. Khabab ibn Arat, the Prophet ﷺ himself, like people going through persecution. Where do we find meaning in the difficulties? Where do we find meaning in the tribulation? Like, where does this fit into something that we can draw a sense of purpose from? Does the question make sense? So we can turn to the persons next to us and talk it out a bit. Why do we have these things, like these trials, these tests? And we come back and we can discuss a little bit, but go ahead. If you don't know the name of the person sitting next to you, just exchange some names first and then talk it out. Like, why these persecutions? And then we'll come back and discuss. You guys figured it out already? Yeah. 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 You got the answer?
And so it seems like a okay. Just thinking like we were thinking the idea that they were saying to me that we would technically like, why do we feel this pain and suffering? Because it's our reaction, I guess I'm left with I feel like that just places why things happen.
Okay, so what are some of the things? Like the nature of the persecution is very evident, but it's subjective, right? There's tribulations, there's tests, whatever language we want to utilize. You don't want to use archaic language or platitudes. That's not going to be helpful. But sometimes your life is hard, right? Clearly, their life is not easy. But to be able to have a sense of presence and consciousness in it, that isn't that I'm just experiencing it in the way that it kind of moves me without any sense of opportunity for growth. Like, what is the point of this? Like, how do we understand its purpose? Right? What did we discuss? Yeah.
It's a means of testing your faith, and with that test, will raise your ranks in paradise, which is our end goal. Like, the dunya is not why we're here. Our end goal is to get paradise. And so that test is a means of us getting that.
Okay. What else? Yeah.
We were talking, and we were saying it's like just to like always like remember Allah and peace your Imam. When you're going through these trials and tribulations, you get to even begin to know yourself and get into yourself and know really well. Everything I say, for instance, we always say La ilaha illallah, Muhammadan Rasulullah, oh Allah, help. But and we talk to everybody else, we discuss it, we talk to everybody else and you forget. And you begin to realize nobody can do anything as much as Allah can. You begin to continue to go to him and talk to him. So we were just talking, discussing.
Okay. Other thoughts? Yeah.
What we were kind of talking about briefly was like if we all had it easy all the time, like there wouldn't be any like comparison. Like we kind of need hardship to understand ease and to not take like times of ease for granted. In the same way, like we need dark, like we need nighttime for daytime. Like there's always a juxtaposition, and there's like an offset for everything we have in Islam. So like if everything was just easy all the time, there wouldn't really be a point, like that wouldn't be a point of living, because that's kind of the point of paradise. Yeah.
Any other thoughts? Yeah.
We're thinking like perhaps maybe like you like a thing and it's not good for you. Perhaps maybe you don't like a thing but it is good for you. And so thinking about like why does the father hit the child's hand when he's trying to reach for the fire, trying to give him a light pain to protect him from a greater pain. So kind of thinking about it from that lens.
Anything else? Yeah.
Going through hardships builds characters and gives you hope when you pass through the hardship.
Yeah. All of it sounds like it makes sense. Like, do you believe that though when you're in it? You don't? Are you shaking your head? No. So translate it now into reality. Don't say the answers you feel like you're supposed to say, because half of you are saying them and ending your statements with an intonation as if it's a question, right? So you don't have surety in it. Do you know what I mean? Like, do you buy into it or not? Do you know?
Discipline comes in also.
What do you mean?
Like, because you have to keep telling yourself why you're doing this, why you believe in this, why you putting yourself through this pain. Like if I start going, like we start going to the gym, it's gonna hurt. But if we have to meet us, if we want to be at a certain level, we gotta go through that pain and keep that discipline, that momentum to get to that level. And once we get there, we're like, wow, okay. Like long nights, working long nights to get to a better place. It's gonna come. You just gotta be disciplined to do that.
To do what?
To work hard and believe, have that faith and that hope and that belief that you're gonna get to your destination.
What's the destination?
Whatever your goal you're striving
But in the gym example, what are you trying to do?
Like if you want to bulk up, you're gonna have to, like let's say you can't lift a certain weight and that's your goal to get to that weight. You're gonna have to put yourself in pain to train to get to that, be able to bench press that weight.
Yeah, and you have a defined objective. If there's not a frame around the experience and you're embracing now the reality of the world only in the context of the world. But what do we know about Meccan revelations? What do we know about what it is that they're trying to shift people and everything that we're talking about piece together? That's why you don't want to see like hadith in isolation of each other. I know this one hadith and that hadith, or I know this verse of Quran and that verse of Quran, but how do they inform one another? How do you understand them in light of each other? You see? And so the Meccan period of Islam doesn't start out with a lot of do's and don'ts and rights and wrongs and rules. The hadith in and of itself says if it started that way, no one would become Muslim. But the initial revelations speak about Allah's oneness. It speaks about the concepts of Tawheed, right? It's very pure monotheism. It speaks about Akhirah, like the afterlife. It speaks about accountability, a day of judgment. Like these are things that are rooted in theologies. The theologies are now what are exerting a prism of understanding of the reality that's in front of them. Why does Abdullah ibn Mas'ud volunteer to recite Quran publicly for the first time and reads verses of Surah Rahman in front of the Kaaba and then gets beaten and then is told, we told you this would happen to you, and then he says, I'm going to do it again tomorrow? Like, what's happening there? When you look in the prism of contemporary, like, difficulties, and you're trying to wrap your head around how is it possible that the people of Palestine, like, just keep getting back up? How do they fundamentally keep doing that? Like, people ask me all the time, in the last 8 months, have you seen more people interested in becoming Muslim? Yeah, right? There's definitely a lot of people who come here when they're interested in Islam, they take their Shahada. Some of you have done that here. Some of you have seen like people do that here. But the number of people who have come and they've said, I see what these people do and they are like, and I don't know what they're made of. And I want to believe in whatever they believe in that has them exert the values and ethics that they exert. That's why I'm looking into Islam. They're not looking into Islam because somebody said, you know, we only let people get married to people from our culture, or we make our kids all miserable by telling them like they only listen to us or they're going to hell, right? That's not what they're saying. They're saying whatever is going on inside of them that allows for their outside to deal with the world in the ways that they do, that's something we've never seen before. And then it informs what it is that's taking place. So you've seen the same videos we've seen, right? May Allah grant them ease and end the occupation that's taking place there. But they keep saying, Alhamdulillah. Like how? How is that a possibility? What is it that drives them towards that? It doesn't mean there's not difficulty, right? Because we also want to be able to understand that in the midst of this persecution, it doesn't mean that they stop being human all of a sudden, but they're in a place where they're still reminding themselves of what is all of this about fundamentally. There's a couple of things we want to look at. If you open up Surah Al-Ankabut, I don't know what number chapter that is. It's the chapter on the spider. If you look at its second verse, right? Its first 3 verses. Somebody can open it. Does anybody have it? You have it? She has it? It's just the first 3. What do they say?
Do the people think that they will be surely make
Yeah. Does anybody have the Arabic in front of them? أحسب الناس from the second verse. You want to read the Arabic? She has it? I mean, clearly she has it. She just read the translation. Yeah. Yeah. Can somebody read the Arabic? You can't be scared to read Quran, you know? And sometimes the manner through which we increase in the value is by exerting the value itself, right? So if you want to be more courageous, the way to increase in courage is by being courageous, right? To increase in patience is by being patient. So if we're in a room full of Muslims and we have it in front of us, don't be worried. Like the hadith says, the one who struggles with their reading has twice the ajr, twice the reward than the one who reads it fluently, right? You want to be in a place where you read the verses, and undoubtedly it comes from shaitan and your nafs. If he gets you to think in your head that you shouldn't be reading Quran out loud, like how does that make sense? Do you know what I mean? Right? Who cares what anybody else thinks? Nobody's going to think anything of you. There's not a person in this room that isn't a sinner, right? Any one of us talks to each other, there's going to be two people who make mistakes talking to each other. Do you know what I mean? So somebody read the Arabic of Surah Al-Ankabut, the second verse, the third verse. Go for it.
أحسب الناس أن يتركوا أن يقولوا آمنا وهم لا يفتنون ولقد فتنا الذين من قبلهم فليعلمن الله الذين صدقوا وليعلمن الكاذبين.
Great. So it's telling you in the Quran why there is these things of trials, right? وَهُمْ لَا يَفْتَنُونَ, that do they think they're not going to be tested? When you have fitna, right, it also is a process through which the individual makes gold pure, right? The idea of it, if you ever go and look this up, when you read this verse, right, you can read it and it's like, oh, that's amazing. But likely most of us in this room have never seen this process of gold being purified. Do you know? You can find anything on the internet. Just go on YouTube and just Google, like gold purification, and see the process. It's not easy. But what they're doing through this process in the fatan, as he is purifying the gold, he is not taking the gold and purifying it just at a surface level. It's not that you go to a window and you're just washing the marks that are on the most apparent accessible point. But the whole point of it is to get to the inner part of the gold and purify it from that standpoint, to get to the impurities that are in the inner part of it. You see what I mean? And that's what the idea is potentially with the heart, that you're getting to places as you rise up in resilience to the difficulties that are in front of you, to be able to now get to parts of yourself that you didn't even know were internalized in some capacity, right? Things that are creating these maladies, these tensions, these anxieties, these stresses. What brings me to gossiping? What brings me to lying? What makes me feel as if I have low self-worth or low self-esteem? And then the second verse is giving us the indication that the whole point of this is so that people are distinguished in terms of those who are actually like very real with their belief and those who fundamentally are not, right? Because you could claim something, but how do you know you buy into it? Is that you actually act on the conviction in some capacity. This can't be understood as a platitude, because even these people, may Allah be pleased with all of them, they got to a place where it was very heavy. Khabbab ibn Arat, who we've talked about, he comes to the Prophet ﷺ while the Prophet is leaning against the Kaaba, right? He's in the shade of the Kaaba. And he asked the Prophet ﷺ, like, are you going to ask Allah to help us? Are you going to make dua for us, right? Are you going to ask Allah to give us victory? And the Prophet ﷺ says to him that amongst those before you, a believer would be seized, a ditch would be dug for him, and he would be thrown into it. Then they would bring a saw that would be put on top of his head to split him into two halves, and his flesh would be torn from the bone with iron combs. Yet all of this did not cause them to abandon their religion. By Allah, this religion will prevail until a rider travels from Yemen to Hadr al-Maut, fearing no one but Allah and the wolf, lest it trouble his sheep. Rather, you are being without patience. You want to reconcile the statement and the notion that the Prophet is sent as a mercy to mankind. Because there's a context now, they are in the early period of revelation. Khabbab ibn Arat, he goes through real hell, like it's tough for him. And he's coming to the Prophet and saying, why don't you just tell God to like make all of this go away? The Prophet's saying to him, Khabbab, don't say these things. Why? Because what else is he going to tell him? That we don't have the ability to deal with this? That you're right, like we don't have what it takes? Or is he going to say, no, today is difficult, but tomorrow is going to be better? That today's hardships are going to bring tomorrow's ease? Which one makes more sense to be able to tell somebody in that moment? And to be able to then understand, well, where does capacity get limited? And how is it do we understand some of these things in the context of this question of why? In particular, you're not going to ever be able to answer directly why someone goes through what they go through. And you don't want to get into that habit. The broader questions theologically of things like theodicy, why is there suffering in the world? Why is there evil in the world? Right? Our theology says that the understanding from most is that like nothing of evil comes from God. That comes from the doings of man. So where you have absolute divine decree, the theological paradox in our tradition is that we still have human agency. We play a role in the creation of things. So when you say in the Quran, there's the verse, La yukallifu Allahu nafsan illa wus'aha, that God does not place upon a soul a burden beyond their capacity to bear, that doesn't mean that humanity does not place burdens upon others that are beyond their capacity to bear. You don't want to think that you are a robot and that there's not opportunity to just say that this is like too heavy. And sometimes the most sensible thing is to not place yourself in the place that you don't have the ability to endure. Do you get what I mean? When we don't create opportunities for people to break out of certain realities, we see them fall back into the difficulties that they're in, right? So when I've shared examples of people that I walk through Washington Square Park, and there's guys, smoke, you want this, you want that, and it's like, no, I don't want any. And then some of them will reckon, and they're like, Imam, is that you? And I'll be like, yeah, I guess. And they'll say, oh, we'll give you a discount, free delivery to your door. I'm like, no, man, I don't want your weed. It's okay. And then sometimes I'll say, why are you doing this? And they'll say, nobody's hiring us to do anything else. I still have to pay for my kids to have books at school, food to eat. Doesn't make any sense that in New York City there's 1 million Muslims, but there's no Muslim influenced or driven reentry program just for people in general. How does that make any sense? But the systems that we have in place also just put people back in the places that they're habituated to fall back into the mess that got them into the trouble in the first place, right? It's not that guy's fault. It's our fault that we haven't built for him opportunities to find his rizq through other means. But some of us are not in the position that he's in. We willfully go back to the places that are beyond our capacity to really endure, or bring us to places that we know we're going to be doing things that we just fundamentally don't want to do. What are you trying to prove in that situation? You're going to be around certain people, you know they're going to bring you to do things that you don't want to do. You're going to be in certain situations that you know you're not the best version of yourself. Why are you imposing upon yourself a burden that doesn't make sense? Isn't the world like heavy enough as it is? And then on top of that, you know that something will yield something, but you're still putting yourself in the place that's beyond your ability. Maybe not forever, but in that moment. Do you get what I mean? We don't want to meet people with platitudes. The world is heavy. When somebody sits down with me in my office and they say, like, why did Allah allow for this to happen? Why famine? Why abuse? Why difficulty? In the broader, like, academic conversations where there is theological opinion, right? In one of the theological schools of Islam, it's called the Maturidi school. They have an opinion that says that if God allows for evil to take place in his plan, it's because it serves a purpose of bringing good. So an Emmett Till moment, for example, that has a young black man accused of something that he didn't do. And then you have white men who are bigoted that beat him, abuse him, lynch him, murder him. And then his mother makes the bold decision of having an open casket funeral so the world can see what it is that happens to black people in anti-black white supremacist systems. It doesn't make sense without the theology of an afterlife. That those are people that still have something that's beyond this world, or a theology that understands who Allah is in the first place. But when the young woman is sitting with me in my office and says, why did my dad hit me when I was a child? How can I say anything other than, I don't know? My job in that situation is not to speak on God's behalf or give a platitude of just have more trust in God, put your faith in God. But I can understand that Allah is Allah, and I don't need to speak on God's behalf and give an answer that isn't going to bring anything to this person, but will justify my passivity of then not being who I'm supposed to be and walking with them through their struggle. So we have hadith where the son of Adam is standing in front of the divine in judgment, and Allah says that you did not feed me when I was hungry, you did not give me drink when I was thirsty, right? You didn't visit me when I was sick. You know, you are Rabbul Alameen. How can I do these things? You didn't visit my servant when he was sick. You didn't feed my servant when he was hungry. You didn't give drink to my servant when they were thirsty, right? The moment you can start explaining things in specific that don't have your capacity to explain, you're just removing yourself potentially from saying, here's my responsibility to you as a sister or brother to help you walk through your struggle. Do you get what I mean? They're ingrained with a theology that informs their worldview. It's not just rotely memorized and regurgitated. And they're in a place now where the opportunity to do what you are saying, like strengthen in faith. Do I choose this or do I choose that? Do I choose dunya or do I choose akhirah? Do I choose this or that? Hawa or what is pleasing to Allah, right? Like what goes into the decision making? And what we said last time, not one of these people in these first years of revelation left Islam as a result of the persecution. There's no record of anybody saying that I don't want to be Muslim anymore, this is too tough. There's some who in the moment, because it gets too heavy and they have to now make the decision of the preservation of their life, that they're in a place where they have to outwardly say something or they're going to be killed. But that's something we've talked about also, that in those instances, that's okay to do. So the crux of it is that their faith precedes the ritual. Their belief precedes the action. When Shaitan creates the inverse for a lot of us these days, that a lot of you in this room, whether you were born into this religion or you converted into this religion, you were given rules before you were given other things. Fard and haram before you were taught how to celebrate the divine in your life. Pray your sunnahs before you're taught whose sunnah it is you're following. And at a certain level, the ritual in and of itself then doesn't yield consequently like what it can to transform your inner self, because it's not being turned to in that way. Do you see? The entire framing of it and then the meaning that goes into it that fundamentally says, despite all of this, I know Allah knows best. And I believe with that sense of conviction that I'm going to understand at the point in time where that day brings everything into understanding. A day of judgment is not just about individual accountability. May Allah grant us ease on that day. But the day of judgment is also where every question of why will be answered. You're going to find out like how everything is made restitute. Everything is made whole. So just like those who wronged you will be taken into account, if you wronged anybody, you got to be ready for accountability. Because you could do whatever you want to in this world. You just have to be able to explain why you did it that way. Do you see? And the nature of some of these things is meeting them with that sensibility. Khabbab ibn Arat has the Prophet to go and speak to. Who do you go and speak to? That's not a YouTube video of somebody giving a lecture in an audience that you weren't even sitting in. If you try to make sense of the difficulty as the difficulty is ensuing, you're in a place where the emotional angst and the heaviness is going to inform the decisions and the choices, the pain that's going to be there. But to allow for yourself to have periods of rest, reflection, contemplation, spaces where you can self-express objectively. One of the things that we're going to move into a conversation now is that they didn't have a masjid at this time, right? There's no masjid in Mecca. So where do they all get together? Like, how do they convene to learn and understand and kind of engage and lean on each other? Do people know? Where do they go? Huh? To Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha's house? No, but close. Or I don't mean close, but no. Where do they go? Like, where do they go to be together? Yeah. Dar al-Arqam, right? The house of al-Arqam. Who is al-Arqam? Al-Arqam is one of the first people to convert to Islam. They say he converted between the ages of 12 and 16. He was a young person, a teenager. And Dar al-Arqam is the house of al-Arqam. Al-Arqam is the son of Abi al-Arqam, right? But he comes from the Banu Makhzum tribe. And this is where they are reading Quran together, the Prophet's teaching them things, but they're experiencing community together. Al-Arqam inherits this house from his father. This is how a teenager gets this house. His dad had the house, and the son then inherited the house. He's known as being like a very quiet, just observant young boy. And he's from the Banu Makhzum, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But his home was near the mountain of As-Safa. And if you've ever been to Mecca, As-Safa and Al-Marwa, these two mountains that we talked about a while ago, that Hajar, peace be upon her, runs back and forth to, ascending the summits to find something of sustenance for her infant son Ismail, who they've run out of dates and water, right? And where his blessed feet kick, the water of Zamzam comes forth, the pool grows, the Jurham are attracted to the water, the city of Mecca gets established in this way. Safa, the mountain, if you've ever been to Mecca, it's like right there near the Kaaba, right? And that means these Muslims in this early part in the revelation, they're meeting like in this home that's in the middle of everything. Why do you think the Prophet chose the home of this boy, Al-Arqam, to have people meet together? There's not hundreds of them, right? They're meeting in the house of Al-Arqam pretty much until Umar ibn al-Khattab becomes Muslim. We'll talk about that eventually in more detail, like chronologically. And after that, they walk out publicly. But until that time, they're convening in these private gatherings. So they're in this house of Al-Arqam. He's a young teenage boy. His home is like pretty much in the midst of like Mecca. It's near the Kaaba because it's near the Safa mountain. And he's from the Banu Makhzum tribe. How do these variables impact the Prophet's decision for them to gather, right? And they're gathering in the dozens. You know, when Umar becomes Muslim, there's now like 40 of them at this time, right? 40 is not a small number of people, it's a large number of people. So if you can just turn to the persons next to you, maybe we can talk this out a little bit. Why do we feel like this house of Al-Arqam was a strategic choice of the Prophet of God? What do we think was compelling him to choose this house? We can discuss for a bit and then we'll come back and talk about it. Okay, so what do we think? Like, why Dar al-Arqam? Why is this like a strategic choice for the Prophet? Yeah.
We were talking about how if it's already this side where like a lot of people are living, like it's in the middle of the busy area, then it wouldn't look suspicious for anyone to go to that area to like get to like go and work. They wouldn't notice anything wrong with people going to that area. There's already people up there.
Yeah, right. If you walk into Times Square and it's filled with people, like nobody is gonna notice that you're walking around in Times Square. Do you know what I mean? Right? Like you fundamentally can walk around in parts of Manhattan, in parts of we went to Brooklyn over the weekend at BAM. They had their annual African bazaar. It was really amazing to go to, and I was there with my kids and some of our family, friends, and others, and we were just looking around. There's like thousands of people at this thing on a Saturday. I was like, it's crazy how many people live in New York, right? Do you know? The Kaaba is the center of all of this. So the way the Kaaba is functioning at this time of busyness is think about like what Grand Central Station or Penn Station looks like at rush hour as people are trying to get on trains. Nobody's noticing you. I don't know how many people have ever had this experience. I have it all the time where I'm walking with my kids and we're walking down the street and I see like a person that I know, a Muslim person, and I'm like waving and saying salams, and there's like, you know, and my kids are laughing in my face like, Baba, that guy doesn't know you. Nobody knows you. I'm like, shut up, you dumb kid. But there, you can walk through New York and literally be oblivious to everything that's around you, just because of kind of the, you know, hecticness and the nature of it, and other variables too. This is what's happening here, right? They're literally like hiding in plain sight. You know, there's so many people that are there. Because imagine if they went the other way. They went to the other side of the mountain, you know, not towards the Kaaba and not towards the busyness, but they went where there's isolation. There's nothing there. That would then likely catch somebody's eye. You know, why is this person doing this? Why is this group of people doing this? What else like comes up from this? Why the house of Al-Arqam? Somebody have their hand raised back there?
Yeah, so we were just discussing that maybe it was accessible, it was like the Kaaba house at that point.
It was the Kawa house of that time. I don't think anyone has ever said that.
This person to accept Islam, and maybe he inspired other people in that sense.
Okay, it was like the Kawa house of that time. Amazing. Yeah, essentially, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, right? But the importance of this place, Dar al-Arqam, is like their first madrasa, you know? It's their first school. But it's also a convening place. They're building bonds with each other. Do you know what I mean? So the importance of the house, we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail. But why this place in the first place? And to speak to this point, if we extrapolate more from the Kawa house parallel, right? They need a place that's able to fit everybody. Do you know? When you go to Kawa house, are you drinking Kawa house right now? No? Oh man. You can only sit there for 20 minutes, right? If it's busy, I don't know if they actually make people get up or not after 20 minutes, but you can go there and there's no room for you sometimes, right? You got to take your coffee to go. Do you know what I mean? The whole idea with this was to have a space where everybody could fit and everybody could belong, you know? Like, it wasn't like, oh man, we reached our capacity. Sorry, like you can't pray Jummah here today. There's no room for you. Do you know what I mean? So the literal like structure had to be able to hold this many people. And if you go to Mecca, you go to Medina, you like understand what the nature was of homes at that time, right? It wasn't like homes that you have today, because there's not this superfluous nature of things. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you have a house, I'm not hating on anybody, but just think about it, right? If you have a house that has 50 rooms in it, 100 rooms in it, do you know what I mean? Like, you can only be in one room at a time. Do you know? Can you be in 100 rooms all at the same time? No, right? Just like you could only drive one car out of many cars that you might have. The success of being able to spend on things that you don't use, how that becomes a metric of success doesn't necessarily make sense. And now here, where resources are limited and real estate is also in relation to proximity to water, right? Like, and they have an influx of people coming in constantly to go to the Kaaba. They're in this place where, like, they're not going to have houses that are like miles wide long. So to have a house that could fit 40 people comfortably in a growing community, that's going to also not be the easiest thing to find, right? What else, like, can we draw from this understanding? Dar al-Arqam. Yeah.
I was also thinking that, how old was he?
He was like a teenager.
Yeah, so like, if you were to go to the house of somebody who's older, like they already have, it's crazy, the through lines in my day, I was talking about traditions with my ninth graders, and then I was talking about Emmett Till, like an art class, just serendipitous, but like somebody who's older already has their traditions, they got like the ways of moving about their house, like they're already like stuck in a lot of ways, and there's somewhat of like a not taintedness to someone who's like in their teenagers, like they're not jaded, right? There's also a level of purity. I was thinking like Adrian, like
Yeah.
like
Yeah, what a good kid.
yeah,
Mashallah.
like awesome, right? And like somebody who commits at that age, right? Who is so self-seeking and so desiring of learning, right? It's also probably very open as well.
Yeah, and it has reciprocity to it. Like, a young person's capacity to listen is matched now also by the Prophet's willingness to listen and entrust to a young person. Do you see what I mean? He knows how to maneuver around things that create structural barricades for many people. Like, this is not a religion that says just because you're older, you can't learn something from somebody who's younger than you. Do you know? It values people across like backgrounds, right? So me, I learn a lot of stuff from my 8-year-old and my 11-year-old. And if I'm gonna ever be in a place, God forbid, where I say to them that fundamentally what they say makes no sense, just by virtue of the fact that I'm older than them, or like I fathered them, like the logic doesn't even make any sense. Do you know? We see like the Prophet empowering people of various backgrounds. His age also makes him not the most like obvious like choice for something like this. Do you know what I mean? It's not something that they're going to necessarily be thinking about in these ways. Other thoughts? Yeah.
I just thought of this right now when you mentioned reciprocity, like maybe because he's just like a teenager, like it also creates some kind of relationship with like the older people in that community or the people in the community to kind of like look after him as well. So there's like a double relationship and like a mutual benefit going both ways.
Yeah. He's also from the Banu Makhzum. Why is that important? This is Abu Jahl's tribe. Why is it important? Why are you making this face?
You said that they won't have any problems. I mean, they're in a same clan, so Abu Jahl cannot hurt him in any way.
Yeah, that's one aspect to it. What else?
Maybe to show that even from Abu Jahl's clan, you are allowed to also embrace Muslim and they will not see you differently.
Yeah, you're such a good person. These are such nice things. I was not thinking this at all. Yeah. Mashallah. He's from the clan that opposes the Prophet's clan, right? This is a clan-based society. Sociologically, like clans stick together. Do you know what I mean? So nobody's thinking in this moment where this man from Banu Hashim is changing our way of living, that someone from Abu Jahl's clan is going to be not only Muslim at this point, but like the place where the Muslims hang out is in a clan's member of Abu Jahl, right? The clan member it's like a person who's related to Abu Jahl, right? Because clans stick together, your tribes stick together. Do you see what I mean? And so here, like the Banu Makhzum, Abu Jahl is literally like the champion of the adversaries. And this young man is in a place where he's the least likely person that they're going to say, oh, where do you think Muhammad and his people are coming together? They're probably in the house of this 13-year-old kid, like in the middle of the city, right in front of us, right? No. And so they're able to just be there. Why is it important to have this space? They're learning Quran. You gotta think, right? In this house, like barakah is not just through kind of some of the things that we understand it to be. Like why some of you feel at peace in this space is because literally thousands of people have prayed here. Do you know what I mean? There's not a place on this carpet that someone hasn't prostrated. Barakah is compounded. The number of people who have taken their shahadas here, the number of people who have broken fast here, the number of people who have read Quran here, right? The number of times these things have happened. In Dar al-Arqam, this is where like Hamza and Umar, may Allah be pleased with both of them, take their shahada, right? Like there is revelation that actually comes down while the Prophet is in Dar al-Arqam. This is where they're learning together. There's actual education taking place, but this is also where they're building community. They're leaning on each other. They're supporting one another through like the ease of the first couple of years of revelation where they weren't publicly stating it, it was just in secrecy. And now through the difficulties of these next few years of revelation, they are coming together in this way. Why is it important that they have this space? Why do they need like this space? And why is it central to the growth of their community? If you just turn to the persons next to you really quickly, like why do you feel like this space is important, you know? And it's not just because it's an educational institution. Because if you pictured in your head right now, the Sunday school you went to, or like anything similar to that, that's not what this thing was, you know? It was a lot more than that. Do you know what I mean? What is it doing for them? And what can we extrapolate from its importance as to why like we need similar spaces in the ways that they had this space? If you just turn really quickly, talk to the persons next to you for a couple minutes, and we'll discuss and then come back and wrap up. Okay, so why is this important? Like this space, why is it a critical space? Not in terms now of its geography, but in terms of what it offers. What do we discuss? Yeah.
We discussed how here at the IC, something that makes it special is that all the people around us right now are choosing to be here, right? Like their family members aren't, or like their parents aren't forcing them to come, right? Everyone's just choosing to show up. And so the same with them back then, because these were all people who were choosing to be in this space, right? They were all coming together because they wanted to be there and they were rejecting the norms of their society to follow something that was like really important to them and to commit the time needed to that.
Yeah, right? This is hadith. Islam began as something strange and it's going to return to something strange. So give glad tidings to the strangers. You know, we used to have hats that we gave out to people. Maybe we'll start them again. That said, you know, glad tidings to the strangers. Because you want to be like, that's just what we are, right? Not like outcasts, but you get the point. And there's a bond that's in that it's not just buying into conforming to what is societally acceptable, but you're staying true, and there's all the people who just get you, you know, and you don't have to explain yourself. What else? Like, why is this space important? Yeah.
There's a lot of healing in community. When you would come together, you forget your individual problems. And I feel like America is a very individualistic society. Everyone focuses on themselves. So in a place like this, we're reminded of other things. You can come out of our head, literally, and figuratively.
Yeah, and just think, like, what do more people have in the world in common right now than anything else? It's not our race or culture or whatever. There's more people in the world right now that share things like anxiety, depression, these types of things. But despite the fact that there's so many people who have this as a reality, the majority of the people who struggle with it are also in a place where they feel more alone than anybody else. They have no connection to anyone else. The essential understanding of how loneliness functions in these ways that is rooted as a consequence of a rugged individualism that's a byproduct of these supremacist systems that breed egocentricity as a modern day shirk. This is what whiteness calls to like my needs and my wants and me, and I'm at the center of everything. Do you know? What else? Like, what else do we take from these spaces? Like, what are the benefits to them? Yeah.
We were talking about the compounding of the baraka, right? And while I was riding on the train down here, these two women were talking about how water can receive energy, right? And we're like 80% water, so if you speak positively to water and look at it under a microscope, it shows this certain geometry, and then you speak negatively, it's negative. It like distorts, and they look differently under the microscope. And so thinking about how a space can have compounded baraka, but then spaces can also hold like the negative that we put out too. And if we're frequenting spaces that have that negative, how that influences us. And then that also had me thinking about the seclusion, right? And going to the woods, going to places where there is an absence of people. And so they automatically like aren't containing, you know, the negative that maybe we walk around and like hear and pick up. You know, you're riding the train and somebody's like talking about like stabbing somebody else, right? Like that's like intense. I like left here the
That happened to you on the train.
the other night, and that happened. There were like two separate people from West 4th to 168, and two separate people were talking about like Mason, like from me to you, like talking about like Mason and beating somebody up and throwing them on the tracks, and then like stabbing somebody.
Yeah.
It was intense. I like got off the train. I was like, whoa, like there's a lot to like receive that kind of stuff. And so thinking about the spaces that we frequent, and so there's like seclusion, like we can isolate in a space. Like it's very easy to isolate here in New York, but then also we can come to a space like this and like get that. Like pick up on that energy that is in the space, that baraka that is left in the space, but also like do you pray in the same spot in your home every day, right? Like does that provide a certain kind of peace? Like if you set that corner up, or if you go to the woods and there's the absence of this negative that's floating around.
100%.
Yep.
Yeah. Other thoughts as we're wrapping up? Yeah.
We talked about how sometimes it's not the space itself, but the concept of it. So they were starting a society in a place that was very hostile,
Yeah, amazing. And you can't do that if you're like stricken by emotional angst and everything just has you dealing with pain in the moment, right? And this is where the entire conversation comes together. They can make sense of their persecution and tribulation in a way that still allows for them to find solace and healing through one another and enables them to have foresight in terms of what they're building for the long term as it's relevant to generations that'll come after, as well as where and how their own eternal existence will kind of go. The whole idea of a house of God in our tradition is to draw attentiveness to God and not the house. And you think about how many spaces that you've been in that claim to be sacred spaces, and you don't feel God's presence. Do you know? And you want to be able to have objective conversations rooted in realities, but you think about it, right? Like you walk into some masjids, you experience it very differently if you're not of a certain race or of a certain culture or a certain class, right? Definitely, like it's different if you're a man versus you're a woman. Do you know? And these are things that we want to think about in the prism of what's happening here in Dar al-Arqam, right? In the house of Al-Arqam, Ibn Abi al-Arqam, right? These are all of these people coming together in community to be able to lean on each other and have a support system. But when they walk in, they're also reminded of who God is. They're in a place where they're able to understand, like in these existences, these gatherings, right? Like our tradition teaches us that gatherings like this are gatherings where the angels descend. May Allah make this a gathering that's like that. You don't have to believe it for it to be true, but that's what they're walking into when they go into this place. I've always wanted to, and it's not that we haven't done it, because like we haven't, it's just, you know, from COVID onwards, there hasn't been a time to implement. Inshallah, this summer, we'll try to lay a foundation, and if not this summer, then next summer at the latest. A system whereby our growing community that is now like 15,000, 20,000, like that form that you all fill out to come here, we've had about 37,000 people fill it out now, right? To give you an idea. It's a lot of people, do you know? There's a lot of different people in New York who think that this is their space, and it is. But in being able to understand that keeping tabs on a cultural community in and of itself is difficult. A diverse community in terms of theology, sect is difficult. Now think about it that exists in the thousands. It's not easy. So one of the things that we wanted to do that we're hoping to execute on sometime in the near future, the coming months, the coming year, is by like borough breakdown where we'd have people who, you know, you have your apartment, a lounge in your apartment, maybe your apartment on a whole, within like a 10, 20 block radius. People who live in your neighborhood, like twice a month would convene in a home in that radius so that we're building kind of sub-communities. You get to know your neighbors, the people that are there, allow for there to be some type of positive social habit transformation. We have a curriculum that we put out, but you're also eating together, like sharing together. And then what allow for us to do is instead of me having to somehow now know what everybody's going through, which fundamentally is not possible. It was at one point where we were much smaller, but we've grown year on year a lot, alhamdulillah. But I can now go to the people who are hosting this in their home and check in with them. And they can come to me and say, hey, you know what? So-and-so is not doing so well. Like, it's really clear that they lost their job. Or, you know, they have a family member who's really sick. And nobody has to go through stuff by themselves in that sense, right? But in the event that that doesn't happen in the coming months, make dua that it does, because I think it'll go really well. It's going to be really good or really terrible, right? It's one or the other, right? People will be like, this crazy guy came to my house. Why'd you let him come to my house? I'm like, welcome to my life. I don't know what to tell you. You can still invite people to your home. Al-Arqam, whether you know it or not, is the name of like numerous masjids numerous like Quran schools, numerous spaces, because Dar al-Arqam was such an important thing. It was just like a quiet young boy. Like, that's just who he was. But what did he do? He let people in his house. I was blessed with like a variety of teachers in regards to different parts of religion, etc. But there was an elder man who said to me at the beginning of my career here that the successful community is the one that knows where their imam lives. All of you have not been in my home, but a lot of you have, and I'd love to have the rest of you over in some time and, you know, when we can figure that out, right? But a lot of you have, and that's a key part to this, accessibility. But I benefit from your presence in my house. You have to shift the paradigm and understand that this gathering, Dar al-Arqam, the establishment of it, was purposely in the home of an individual, and it wasn't in the marketplace. It's not the same when you eat together in a restaurant versus when you eat together in your home. That's just fact, whether you want to admit it or not, but it is. It's different when you eat from the food made by hands that care about you versus hands that only think about you in terms of monetary gain. It's very different. You got to get to a place where you're bold enough to not find validation just by frequenting spaces that are the supposed to's to delineate successes in certain ways. Why can't you invite people to have a meal in your house? When you all come to my house sometimes, on Sunday, we're going to have a brunch for converts in my home, right? It's a potluck, you know? So just make it potluck if you don't have like the ability to cook, right? That's fine. I don't know how to cook. I'm not cooking for people. But you can come and we can be together. You go out with some people, like bring them over, right? There's adab to this also, like you'd want to think as well. You're going to somebody's house, right? Like there's literal revelation in the Quran that has to tell people to get out of the Prophet's home because he wouldn't tell them to leave the house, right? But in being able to understand that as a secondary point, the first point is being able to think out, how do we create some of that blessing in our home? I'm feeding people in my home. I'm deepening in a bond with people in my home. Do you know? And it doesn't have to be 50 people, but you got close friends, people that you vibe with really well, like build a different bond with them in that sense. Do you know what I mean? Bring some barakah into your house. There's a lot of us in this room who were the only ones who have ever prayed in our apartments individually. You've never had a jamaat in your room before, a congregational prayer, right? Why? You just need 2 people. Like bring somebody over. You got a buddy, tell him, hey, let's come pray dhuhr in my house together. It'll add to the barakah. You know what I mean? Would this place feel the same if you were the only one that ever prayed in it and you always prayed alone? No. If you came here and we had iftars together on Mondays and Thursdays and it was just you, like we just had people line up one at a time and ate alone and then left alone. To do things on your own is a great skill set. I'm not saying don't do that, right? We're not talking about like having a dependency that's unhealthy, but to think about it in the standpoint of this young man al-Arqam, he is the catalyst for numerous acts of goodness and benefit because he was also willing to open up his house to others. Do you see what I mean? And it was just people of all backgrounds, right? And this will be the last thing that I say, and then we'll wrap up for tonight. It's also that he didn't conditionalize who could come into his house. There's some of us who in our homes, we've never had people eat at our dinner tables that come from a different culture than us or a different race than us. We're too stuck in these places of what would people think, right? And a house of God is meant to draw attentiveness to God and not the house. The gatherings of the divine are based off of principles of inclusivity, not exclusivity, right? We sit in a university institution. I used to work at Princeton. Princeton is known as Princeton not because it lets kids in of certain GPAs and extracurriculars and SATs and whatever else. Princeton is also Princeton because of who it doesn't let in. And if it started to let everybody in, it wouldn't be Princeton anymore. It's Princeton because of who it keeps out also. A lot of our gatherings function in the same way. Al-Arqam ibn Abi al-Arqam, all of them were in the house together. There was no other place in Mecca that had that kind of diversity in a private home altogether. You know what I mean? You miss out on the barakah because everybody's got to only be from your background. You got to break that nonsense. It's a characteristic of Jahiliyyah. May Allah protect us from it. And so just looking at the way Al-Arqam's house functioned has so much that you can extrapolate. And he was just a teenager. He was a young boy, younger than pretty much all of us likely in this room. But his willingness to play that role enabled there to be healing, support, growth. And you go throughout the Muslim world, his name is written on a bunch of buildings, pretty much in every country, because he created this space in his house. Just think about why you can't do that. And maybe you can't in your home, but then why don't you go to other people's houses, right? Don't just frequent like these other spaces that are not that, and make a point of accepting invitations from people who you can get away with not spending time with because they don't come from the same backgrounds as you, right? You know why Kawa House feels so nice, right? It's because everybody goes to Kawa House. It's not just Yemeni people drinking chai in Kawa House, right? You all go there. Most of you are not Yemeni. Do you know what I mean? Right? And you can walk in there. There's young people, old people, black people, white people, brown people, Muslim people, non-Muslim people. Do you know? There's barakah in this. There's not a lot of spaces that are like that. Do you know what I mean? And they're also good guys, like the people who run this place. So you can feel like when you're drinking this stuff, there's like blessing in these things. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay, so we're gonna take a pause here. Tomorrow is Thursday. Sheikh Faz is gonna have a halaqah. Friday we'll have, it's Fried Chicken Friday. So we'll have, yeah, there you go. So stick around after Jummah for lunch. Saturday and Sunday, the building's closed, but this Sunday we'll have a brunch at my place for our converts group. So it's for people who are converts to Islam, or exploring Islam, or a family member of someone in one of those categories. And that should be at 11 o'clock. So if you fit into those categories or you know somebody who does, feel free to join us, inshallah. Is there anything else anybody wants to announce before we wrap up? Yes. Yeah. Oh, when is it?
So, Assalamu alaikum. So we started doing these spiritual seclusion kind of walks, hikes, hangings. We're keeping them local right now. Inshallah, we'll be getting to doing some like serious hikes at some point. But the next one, we met up last month. The next one we're gonna do is with Dr. Marwa on June 23rd. I have a Zoom call with her on Friday to like lock in like the serious details, but if anybody wants to join the WhatsApp group, I can share the code with you, and we'll be sending an email out and stuff like that. Yeah, June 23rd. Mark on your calendars. It'll be in the morning. I mean, y'all wake up for budget, right?
The first one we did in Central Park was really nice. A lot of people came out for it. So definitely try to join if you can. Okay, so let's take a pause here. If you guys put the chairs back against the wall, the building's gonna close in like 15, 20 minutes. So people can also gradually make their way out. We'd